The Tolkien Road, Episode 22, On Fairy Stories. All right, go ahead. The Tolkien Road, 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 the Tolkien Road. Hi everyone, John Carswell here. Welcome to the Tolkien Road podcast, your conversational guide to Middle-earth and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. On this episode, we examine and discuss Tolkien's influential essay on fairy stories. While both Greta and I are hungry to start our read-through of The Lord of the Rings, I felt it was important to consider the ideas Tolkien lays out in On Fairy Stories because of the role they play in The Lord of the Rings. After all, this is the place where he lays out the distinctively Tolkienian concepts of recovery, escape, consolation, subcreation, and Eucatastrophe. Challenging though it is, it's also quite beautiful and insightful. I hope you enjoy our discussion. And of course, if you haven't already, please leave us a rating and feedback on iTunes. We'd love to know what you think of the podcast. Enjoy the show! Hello there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Tolkien Road podcast, your conversational guide to Middle-earth and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Yes.
Oh, wow. Coming out of the gate strong.
I've always wanted to do it a little more like, professional sounding.
Is that what that is?
Yeah, that's my professional voice.
Welcome to the
Tolkien Road. Yeah. All right, so Greta, how are you?
I'm awesome. How are you, John?
Pretty sweet, I guess. Yeah.
See, you should have said that in a professional voice. That would have sounded better.
Pretty sweet, I guess. I can't say that in a professional voice.
Yeah.
The professional voice is hard to keep going. I've always admired the people who can, do that full time. Sunday. I think there are people that just have voices like that. They don't really talk like that.
I think that's probably true.
They don't talk like that on purpose. It's just the way their voice sounds. They just sound awesome all the time.
Yeah, it's just... Yeah, they can't help it, right?
It's kind of like people that work at that tire place.
Discount Tire.
Mm-hmm.
Today's a great day at Discount Tire. This is Bob. How may I help you?
Oh, thank you so much for calling Discount Tire. Man, you rock. How may I help you? Oh, yes.
The rabbit trails early this episode.
Yeah, we are. Okay. Well.
They do have great customer service at Discount Tire, though.
Hello, everyone. On this episode of the Tolkien Road podcast, we are going to discuss On Fairy Stories. So I know that this has been the most protracted lead up to actually reading Lord of the Rings in the history of all podcasts.
Thank you. At least you're admitting it. But
I really felt like we needed to hit On Fairy Stories before we started with the Lord of the Rings. Started into the actual story of the Lord of the Rings. And I hope, and I think by the end of this episode, everyone will agree unanimously. The entire human population of the planet Earth will agree unanimously with me.
That we needed to read On Fairy Stories before beginning Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, you really do. Yeah, it'll all make sense once we get there.
Looking forward to it.
So, yes, we're gonna discuss On Fairy Stories in this episode. I wrote some haiku. Greta, did you write some haiku?
You know it.
Haiku time! Yeah!
Haiku time. Okay, I think that needs to stop.
Okay. Alright,
you have to go first just because you've used that voice way too much so far in this podcast.
We gotta do rock, paper, scissors.
Okay, but only if you don't use your professional voice.
Just one out of one. Best one out of one.
Rock, paper, scissors, shoot! Oh. You always do it wrong!
You always do it too early.
I watched our boys do rock, paper, scissors in the kitchen this afternoon. And 6 and 7 year old boys. They're rock, paper, scissors champs. This is how you do it. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot. And then when you say shoot is when you point your weapon.
We've got to move along, so quit explaining the rules of rock, paper, scissors.
Well,
all right, we'll do it your way. We'll do it your way, all right?
Because it's the right way.
Okay, come on.
Okay, rock, paper, scissors, shoot. Oh! Yes. Paper smothers rock.
That's right.
All right, I guess that means I go first. Maybe you get to choose. If you win, you get to choose.
Yeah, you go first. Actually, you know what? I'll go first. I think I have more than you do. Unless you got really inspired this afternoon.
I have 4.
Oh, okay. Well,
one of them's kind of a cheat.
All right. Well, that's all right.
Okay.
I'll go first.
All right.
I'll go first.
Do it.
To love is to know truly. To know without love, to suffer slow death.
Oh. I like it.
Yeah.
I like it a lot.
Yeah. Next.
Mine's much more straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
To the point.
I read on fairy stories. It was good.
On fairy
It was boring.
No, I was seriously thinking about it yesterday as I was reading. I was trying to think about what are my haikus going to be about, and I was trying to be on fairy story. Oh dang, that's not even. That's more than 5. No, that's on fairy stories. It is very long. It is quite long, but worthwhile if you have the time. That was going to be my. But anyway, I did a little bit better, I think. Okay, so here's my official first one. What's a fairy tale? Oxford is of no help here, but Tolkien sure is.
Nice, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice.
Thanks.
All right, next. I actually have 2 versions of this one, and I'm trying to think. I like this. All right, I like this one better. We recover truth in its fullness when we see with eternal eyes.
Wow. Your haikus never sound like haikus. They sound like run-on sentences.
Mm-hmm.
But I like it.
Yeah, well, that's the way I roll.
That's where you roll. Okay. Here's my next one. It is not creatures that make the tale, but the air that blows in their world.
Nice.
Yeah.
Next, for me.
Uh-huh.
Can it be a tale? This wondrous joy and sorrow we indwell daily.
This wondrous joy and sorrow we indwell daily.
We indwell.
Oh,
daily.
indwell.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were saying end well. I was like, end well? What? What do we end well? Okay, that makes more sense. I like it.
Yeah.
That's good. All right. This one I'm calling kind of a cheat because it's actually just one sentence out of On Fairy Stories, but it fit perfectly into haiku form. So I had to do it.
Okay.
So I credit this as a Tolkien haiku. I cannot take any credit for this.
All right. Fair enough.
Fantasy, of course, starts out with an advantage. Arresting strangeness.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you discovered it. You discovered that it was a haiku,
mm-hmm.
kind of like we discovered that the titles of the 3 Lord of the Rings books form a haiku.
Right.
It's just further evidence that Tolkien was
a haiku
really
fan.
what he was trying to do in all of his life's work was create haiku. Yeah. Obviously.
Amazing. It's awesome.
All right, last one for me. Called to a sacred mission, to escape the dark, subcreators all.
I was wondering when you were going to put subcreators in there.
Mm-hmm.
That was good. That was very good. All right, here's my last one. The Nativity, the Cross, the Resurrection, Eucatastrophe.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, good. High five. Good haikus.
Woohoo! I think we rocked that haiku time.
Yeah, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we could do about 4 episodes on fairy stories. There's a lot. It's very dense, much like pretty much anything Tolkien writes.
Yep.
But I really want to try and get this. I don't want to get too bogged down in all of the fine detail. I just really want to hit the high points when it comes to on fairy stories. So yeah. By the way, several months back I published kind of a little synopsis of On Fairy Stories in 3 parts on truemyths.org. You can check that out. You can go to truemyths.org and look under all posts or just search for On Fairy Stories and you should find it. But anyway, On Fairy Stories it's kind of like Tolkien's official glimpse for us into what was going through his mind when he started writing Lord of the Rings, from a very kind of just overall what he was trying to accomplish and his insights from having just written The Hobbit. So, do you know when it was written?
Oh, he wrote On Fairy Stories after writing The Hobbit?
Yeah. So did you pick up on when he was writing this?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I didn't really give you any background information to read, but basically he wrote this in 1938 and maybe early 1939 and delivered it, I think, in 1939, although some people say 1938, but somewhere in the late 30s, which would have been after he wrote The Hobbit, right?
But before.
But, well, really as he was starting out writing The Lord of the Rings.
I see.
Right?
Okay.
So he wrote The Hobbit in 1935, 1936, published in 1937, and then these are like his reflections having finished it, and what almost he doesn't come out and say this is what I learned writing The Hobbit, but he comes out and talks about, you can tell that he's kind of like he had to do a lot of thinking about what fairy stories are, and what's the, like, why even write them, like why even bother with them, right? Yeah. We see similar themes when we look at like Mythopoeia, right, which he also kind of composed in this period. So although there was a longer composition for that.
He wrote on fairy stories, right?
He started Mythopoeia on fairy stories, yeah.
Right, because I think he mentions something from Mythopoeia in on fairy stories.
Right, you're right, yeah. Well, and so he started Mythopoeia. I don't know that he really finished Mythopoeia until much later.
I see.
But he's definitely started like the basic ideas in Mythopoeia.
Okay.
Which came earlier than on fairy stories.
Gotcha.
And then, of course, Leaf by Niggle was written in 1940, I think. So, and again, like, to me, those three, even though they're all different genres they're all different genres of literature. Fairy stories obviously is an essay. Leaf by Niggle is a short story. Mythopoeia is a poem. All three of them, though, I feel like are very core to kind of his literary aesthetic, right, and his literary outlook.
Yes. And
not just that, but to like his philosophical outlook too, because he expressed his philosophy through literature, right? He didn't write a ton of highfalutin writings like this, right? He wrote this. He wrote something on Beowulf, which is really good. We probably won't get to that for a long, long time. It's a little more academic anyway than even this, but it's still really good. So anyway, on fairy stories, originally a lecture and published several years later in the form that we have now.
Where did he deliver the lecture?
At University of St. Andrews, I think, in Scotland. Okay. I think. Okay. Did I write it down in my notes here? No, looks like no.
I was just curious.
Yeah. Anyway, it was somewhere in Scotland, I'm pretty sure. He did it as the Andrew Lang lecture or something along those lines.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. He mentions Andrew Lang quite a bit in the lecture.
Yeah, well, that's
in the essay.
And that's why. Yeah. All right. So he actually the one thing that makes this more easily digestible, even though it is very dense, is he does kind of divide it up into different sections.
Yes.
But the first big thing that he wants to cover, and he's really setting out to talk about what is a fairy story. Okay. And most, before you read this, what would you have said if somebody asked you to define a fairy story or a fairy tale?
Okay, so that was my first question, because I was wondering, I remember when you first mentioned this about on fairy stories, I was like, is that the same thing as a fairy story, the same thing as a fairy tale? Which I assumed it was. But I would say that a fairy story or a fairy tale, like I would think of, probably Cinderella or, the Peter Pan. I mean, like I would think of something very just animated.
Yeah.
And, geared toward children and, with little creatures that don't exist in real life. And like the Frog Prince. Just things that you just don't expect to happen.
So you said two things right there that are really kind of the key things I think of when people think of fairy tales. I think of first, they're for kids. And second, they consist of little things.
Fairies.
Little, right? Like little and
Tinkerbell.
kids. They're not for grown-ups, right? That's the thing
Absolutely.
that everybody thinks of when they think of fairy tales, fairy stories. And of course, what Tolkien, and I think it's since Tolkien's time, the term fairy tale still really applies, I think, in most people's minds to the kind of, to those kinds of stories, right? To like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, the things that Disney like kind of took and made their own in the these like old folk tales that Disney kind of took and made their own in the middle of the 20th century, big time, and I think people would still use that for fairy tale. People don't really talk about fairy story, at least not in America, but what we think of as what Tolkien writes and what many others have written since, we would now call probably fantasy, right?
Right, yes.
So it seems like there's been kind of this divergence, probably in large part thanks to Tolkien, since this writing. But a fairy story, Tolkien really takes to task the idea that fairy stories, fairy tales are historically these things that are about little creatures and for kids, right, and for children. Those are the two kinds of fallacies that he wants to deal with before he goes on to more fully express why he thinks fairy story is like the pinnacle of literary achievement. Right. So how does he define fairy story? What's kind of the key of his definition of fairy story?
Well, he defines it as right. Doesn't he say that it is that it really has nothing to do with having fairies or even dragons or anything like that, but it's about the perilous realm, right? That it's where the story takes place, right? It's the nature of the surrounding, the place where it happens.
Yeah. A fairy story has to do with this place that Tolkien calls the perilous realm, which is to say, not our world, right? It's
another world.
It's a world that's full of danger and odd creatures and that it's perilous, right? It is literally full of peril, and that probably strikes against the notion of like little Tinkerbells fluttering around, like la 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 fluttering around.
Although Peter Pan's world was pretty perilous.
True, but I think, but Tolkien really wants to get rid of this idea of like the Tinkerbells. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Even though he probably wouldn't have,
or the fairy godmothers,
if he even knew what Tinkerbell was. Probably, I think Peter Pan came before him, the story at least. But just this idea of like, when you wish upon a star, like that kind of, just that annoying thing that people that makes the grown-ups in us go, oh, not fairy tales, like those are for kids, like we want to go see something that's a little grittier and a little more real, right?
Yes,
that's a big thing, like the reality of it, because you throw Tinkerbells into something and people are just like, oh, that's make-believe,
Well, Tolkien wasn't saying though that make-believe creatures couldn't exist, and I mean obviously there's plenty of make-believe characters in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So he's not saying that you can't have talking trees, right? And you can't have, super duper dragons and goblins and trolls and all that. But what he's saying is the world in which they live needs to have a certain character about it that is other.
Well, we'll come back to that point in another section, right? But it's hard to. I think Tolkien would agree with this. It was hard for him probably to define what he didn't like about people's preconceived notions of fairy tales without kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because in his mind, he probably would say, I don't have a problem with Tinkerbells per se in a story, right? But if it's all like, if it's kind of like world of pure imagination, like this like kind of just manufactured
just that sugary
sweetness. Kind of like the Disney dreamland, what I'm saying, of old. Which
by the way, a lot of I remember reading the actual original Little Mermaid with the kids and being horrified at how it ended. I was like, oh,
right,
this isn't how it's supposed to end.
Well, and I'm not out really to attack Disney here. I'm just saying,
I'm not either. But
I'm just saying,
definitely changed things.
Yeah, and kind of made things seem a little more acceptable, a little less rough around the edges.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And for Tolkien, I think that is like this being rough around the edges, this sense of great peril is a key thing. So again, fairy stories are stories that take place in the perilous realm. All right. So next, he deals with the origin of fairy stories.
Yeah.
So, in one word, what is the origin of fairy story? Do you remember this?
In one word?
In one word.
I don't know that I remember one word. I feel like, honestly, the section I spent a whole time reading, and then at the end, Tolkien was like, yeah, well, basically, I don't know where they came from.
Right.
And I'm like, great, thanks, Tolkien.
Right.
No, I don't remember just one word.
He says, but how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairy is more potent. The
adjective.
Yeah, he says, the mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into swift water. If it could do the one, it would do the other. It inevitably did both. All right, so... Yeah, I mean, he basically says when, go back thousands of years and when people were just starting to, like, kind of form language, and what was the thing that man, gave him the ability, like, what gives him, an animal can look at something and know that there's an object there, right? And say person or something like that, right? Like, our cats look at us and they say my person, right? Person that lives in this house, right? But they don't think maybe beyond that, right? But we as humans start to say, okay, we have these minds that go deeper, and we say, okay, cat, all right? And then we say white cat. Now I can say, okay, what if this was a blue cat? Right? And so that the adjective sparks the imagination to be able to say, well, even though our sun is yellow, why couldn't it be green? Right? Why could there be a world with a green sun? Yeah, right? I see. Science tells us that, there are green suns and that kind of thing in other parts of the universe. But before then, before Tolkien's time, well before Tolkien's time, men had no idea. All they knew was the sun. They saw stars in the sky, but you can't tell what colors those stars are unless you have a really powerful telescope, right? But, just take any object, right? Purple person, right? I mean, just being able to imagine things like that. So Tolkien says the origin of fairy stories, the origin of fantasy, is in the adjective. Yeah, I like this. So we may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine. Or we may cause woods to spring with silver leaves and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. Fairy begins. Man becomes a subcreator.
Which is taking something that already exists, right, and altering it.
Yeah.
In a certain way.
Right, exactly.
Making a different form.
Yeah. I mean, so once we have said, okay, well, here is this thing that is a certain color, I recognize that, I've described it, now could I have something else, right? Now could I have something in another color? And it's that same idea he talked about in Mythopoeia, where we're able to we receive an inspiration, we kind of can envision something. Yeah. And then we're able to go about the task of actually forming it, of actually creating it, right? Of actually putting it to paper, or of putting it to canvas, or of recording it and trying to duplicate the sound, right? Or trying to kind of take the idea of the sound and turn it into a song. So that's, adjective is the origin. I really like what he says. This was the first time I read this resonated very strongly with me. You ever heard somebody say, oh, well, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is just like, it's basically the Odyssey with some stuff thrown in, when people do that. I hate that. Like, I can see, like, like, it's okay to say that. Like, I see a lot, like, there's a lot of similarities, and be like, oh yeah, they use the Odyssey as a blueprint. I mean, sometimes people do that, and that's understandable. But I really hate when people take a kind of critical view and they're like, oh, that's just this with different trappings, you know? Like, there's only, I mean, there's, you know, how many different, like, kind of basic story structures are there out there? I don't know. I'm not really into that. I bet you could really, if you tried to boil it down as far as you could, you would be left with only a few.
Probably.
But the whole point is that, like, it's the details that make it truly what it is, right? And that can make it truly great, right?
Yes.
I mean, the songs that you hear, what are the basic structures of those songs, right? There's only like a handful or a couple, right? Of basic structures, you know. You know, like, it's like the Beatles wrote all those structures first, and it's like, well, no, they took them from somebody else. But the point isn't that they took some structure that was already there, right? You could keep going back and continue to find people who use that structure, but it's how they did it, right?
Yeah.
It's all of the particulars of it, you know. So I really like when he says, we read that Beowulf is only a version of Dat Erdmanniken, or Erdmanniken. Students of that kind may express, or statements of that kind may express in undue abbreviation some element of truth, but they are not true in a fairy story sense. They are not true in art or literature. So he says they express some element of truth, but it's precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all, the general purport that informs with life the undissected bones of the plot that really count. I mean...
Yes, yeah, undissected bones.
Exactly. It's like, human beings, you can boil us down to kind of a basic, like, what we are, right? You know, it's like, you can be like, oh, that person is just a human being. They just have these qualities, but it's everything that's individual about that person that makes them an individual person.
Soul,
yeah,
right? And the spirit.
But not just the soul. It's also their physical description, right?
Oh,
like it's also all of the particulars
their eye
of
color and their hair color. And,
yeah. You know, you can have two people that look a ton alike but are completely different, even in their physical appearance when you really get close, right? I mean, I've known twins like that, right? Where, like, they're literally identical twins, and you think they look a lot alike at first, but then you start to notice how different they really are. You know, it's kind of uncanny, you know, when you start to see that. So Tolkien is trying to build upon this idea that the adjective is where fairy stories came from, to say that the adjective is the way that we find all of the particulars about stories and about the way things look and the way things are. I mean, have you ever listened to a song or seen a painting and you're just like, I don't know what it is about that song, but there's something about it that just captivates me, you know? You can't put your finger on it. And that's, to me, when an artist can do that, that is like true artistic magic, right? That's what makes something truly great, right? Anyway, any thoughts on the origin of fairy stories there?
No.
Okay.
No, I think you covered it very well.
All right. Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, why don't we take a break there?
Oh, okay.
And we will come back and discuss the whole idea of children in fairy stories, as well as all of the ideas that he expresses in the second half on fairy stories. So,
sounds great.
All right. Don't go away.
Stay tuned.
Do you know the tale that Tolkien called the kernel of the Middle-earth mythology? Beren and Luthien is the story of an outlaw mortal and an elvish princess tasked with obtaining a Silmaril, one of the holy jewels of the Blessed Realm, from the Iron Crown of the Dark Lord Morgoth. In my new book, Tolkien's Requiem, I explore the legend of these doomed lovers. In doing so, I aim to provide a backdoor into the world of the Silmarillion for those who have struggled to give it a go. One of Tolkien's greatest achievements, the story of Beren and Luthien, deserves to be as well known as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Get your copy of Tolkien's Requiem today by visiting truemyths.org/Beren. That's truemyths.org/BEREN. Happy reading! Okay, we're back. So, are fairy stories mere child's play? Are fairy stories mere child's play?
Are you asking me?
I am asking you.
Are you asking me what I thought before I read?
Yeah, sure.
Before I read?
Tell me what you want to tell me.
Okay. Well, to be honest, yes, I used to think they were. And especially, when you're, I remember watching lots of Disney movies when I was younger and you really enjoy them and you kind of reach, that too cool for school age, where you're like, oh, I'm too big to watch Cinderella, and then you're kind of done. And so I think maybe middle or early high school, I was like, I'm done with fairy stories. I'm done with fairy tales. I'm too big. I'm too smart to really appreciate them, right? Well, then, fast forward, I don't know, like 20 plus years, and I'm reading, actually, some of Andrew Lang's, some of his collection of fairy tales to the kids, and I'm like, wow, these are really good. These are really good. And I really enjoyed them. And I know part of that was seeing the kids enjoy them, but you realize, I think, when you go back and read them with fresh eyes as an adult, especially if they're good fairy tales, you appreciate them so much more because you understand a lot of the underlying sarcasm or the different meaning that the author and you understand the morals and you can appreciate them more, I think, as an adult if you let yourself. So I would say initially yes, I did think so, and then once I started reading them with the kids, I was like, oh no, these are actually pretty good. And then after I read on fairy stories, I was like, I need to read more fairy stories.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, I will tell you, so I am not much of a fan of, and again, we talked about this in the first half of the episode, there seems to have been this divergence between kind of what Tolkien helped fashion with his fantasy, with Lord of the Rings, with this genre of fantasy, and fairy tale. I think it's still appropriate, even though Tolkien calls fairy stories the perilous realm. I think what he started calling fairy stories has become fantasy, and fairy tale has kind of remained this fairy tale thing. And I am not a big fan of fairy tale. The thing I really love about the Lord of the Rings is the incredible depth of the world, like the utter sense of reality that he imparts to it, and this notion that you could walk into this place and get lost in it, right? To me, that's one of the crowning achievements of the Lord of the Rings. But yeah, he's even so, he says these things aren't meant to be just child's play, right?
Right.
I think Tolkien was not a fan of the modernist mindset, and he attributes a lot of this problem of relegating fairy story to the nursery as an accident of our domestic history. Basically, this conceit that people developed in the 19th century that adults need to deal with reality and the real world, and when they say the real world, they mean the material real world, right? Instead of dealing with and they need to leave fairy story and things that aren't material and real behind, right? Okay. And Tolkien obviously takes issue with that and is not a fan of that notion.
Right.
So you can kind of see this play out in Leaf by Niggle at the very end when the two people are having the conversation after Niggle has gone on, and we go back to the town, whatever the town was called, and the two, those two guys are having the conversation, and one of them's like this real obnoxious bureaucrat who's it's like, oh, that Niggle, he was worthless, right? He never did anything productive.
Yeah.
He spent all his time trying to make a painting of all things,
Right.
Like, give me a break. That his time could have been used so much more productively.
So irresponsible.
Right? So irresponsible of him, right? And Tolkien's that's the mindset that Tolkien is taking issue with, right? That the only thing that's valuable for adult human beings to be absorbed in is the everyday business world of reality, right?
Because it's practical.
Exactly, because it's practical,
purpose,
right? And it's practical in a very strong materialist sense. It's like, we're gonna die, gotta make practical, gotta provide, gotta get things done, gonna die. That's what's really behind it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the rat race, yeah. It's this notion of like scarcity, and we're gonna die, and miracles don't happen, and there probably isn't a God, and so we better get things done, gosh darn it. And
it's all on me.
Because I only got so much time, and you better not get in my way, right? Because I want to get it done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And that's kind of a litany. I could add to that list of these different mindsets. But when it all comes down to it, Tolkien is going against that sort of mindset, yes. Right? Mm-hmm. Tolkien lived his life in a way that's utterly different from that. Mm-hmm. So, not a fan of keeping fairy stories or fantasy in the nursery. I think Tolkien would say that maybe adults need it even more than children. He has a lot of interesting thoughts in this section I'm not going to go into. They're sort of complex, but he talks about how kind of the suspension of disbelief, the willing suspension of disbelief, right. And we think like kids don't get it. Like he really hates that notion that like we talk down to kids. Yeah. And like, oh, I can tell them the story because they're such little fools. They'll believe anything. You know?
Right. Right. Yeah.
It's like, you jerk. Like you really think kids. You really think like like maybe really young kids, but like you think like a 5 or a 6-year-old, even like a 3 or a 4-year-old, can't know the difference, and maybe doesn't even suspect a little bit that Santa Claus isn't real. Right. You know? Yeah.
We definitely don't give them the credit they deserve.
Exactly. And it's like, well, and if you like actually provided them with enough information to make that assessment, they would probably be able to figure it out on their own. Right. On their own. I can't talk. On their own.
I know what you're trying to say.
So anyway, some interesting thoughts there. We can't go too far into that right now, but now I want to get on to the meat of On Fairy Stories, which is, I think, the best things about this, and that's where he starts to talk about what good fantasy actually does for us and why we need it.
The purpose.
So he says that fantasy aspires to enchantment. So what is enchantment?
What is enchantment?
Yeah. Do you remember how he defines it? And you don't have to be word for word, but do you remember the idea of how he defines enchantment?
Yeah, doesn't he basically? It's in a way, it's losing yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, it goes kind of hand in hand. I know he talks about escape separately, but I feel like enchantment and escape go hand in hand when you're, because enchantment is you're just becoming so wrapped up in something, and you feel like you're being transported. Mm-hmm. To another world, and you're actually part of that world. You can see yourself in it.
Right. Yeah. Enchantment. Enchantment is where isn't like willing. He poses it to willing suspension of disbelief, because willing suspension of disbelief is literally, I am going. It's like seeing a play and saying, like, okay, I'm going to pretend like this is actually happening right now. We have to do that because it's obvious it's not. Right. He says enchantment is so the power of good fantasy is this enchanting ability to make us forget that we're reading something that's not actually primarily real. Right. Right. Again, like that's what he does in The Lord of the Rings, right? It's so engrossing. Yeah. And yes, you read it and you're if you take a step back, there's not a such thing as a hobbit, but at the same time, It's not like you're reading the story and it just feels like you're reading a history, right? Mm-hmm. Someone's account of literally having lived through this, right? Yeah. And so that's what he's going for. He talks about this idea of a secondary world, to make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief. So he's going for...
You talked about that secondary belief. I thought that idea of secondary belief was really interesting.
Yeah. Why?
Because it's... I think because it put he finally put a word to something that I've experienced on several occasions when reading certain books, where you almost in a way you forget where you are for a little while, and then you kind of come back and you're like, oh, like you almost have to reorient yourself. And I think that's because of that secondary belief. Like you became so engrossed in something, and that you really believed that there was this other place, and that you were there. And so it's a belief, but it's secondary to the world that you are actually in. But do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, well, it's related to the primary world, right?
Right.
And that goes with what he says in this section, which is that fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason. And he says, on the contrary, the keener and the clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make.
Yes.
He basically says, like, madmen don't make good fantasy, right? People that make good fantasy are the clearest, most reasoned people, right? Because they're able to create something that seems so real out of taking adjectives, out of saying, okay, what if we had a sun with a green world, right? Okay, a madman would do crazy things with that, right?
Yeah. A
well-reasoned person would say, okay, let's change the sun to the color green, and we're gonna have orange water or something like that.
Right.
And then what's that world going to be like? Right.
Well, it's because it's so closely related. In a way, it's so closely related to what you do know, to your primary world, and it's just changed just enough, right? That you still feel like it's something that you're familiar with, even though you're really not. Right.
And he says, creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, but not a slavery to it. Right? So it recognizes fact, but it's not slave to it.
Right.
And so that, I think, is a key recognition as we begin the next section, which is recovery, escape, and consolation. These are the effects of fairy story. These are like this is maybe the most powerful section to me. So what is recovery? Do you remember his little definition of recovery? And these things sort of go in this order, right? All right, so he says recovery.
Is regaining.
Yeah, is a regaining. A regaining
of a clear view.
Right. And what does he mean by that? Keep reading.
I do not say seeing things as they are, and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are, or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need in any case to clean our windows, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness.
Yeah.
So it's basically looking at things with fresh eyes.
Right.
Because you do. I mean, you get you become so familiar with things that you do. You just don't look at them in the way that they're meant to be seen, because you're just so used to looking at them that you're just kind of like, whatever. Yeah,
I really think that this is like a spiritual seeing, right? Like, I think what he's trying to say here is that, so much of, like in 19th century literature in both America and Europe, there was this big movement of realism. They wanted to portray everything just as it was, right? And that's and it's largely a product and a reaction to the culture in which they were in, which was, smack dab in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and people, life seems to be becoming more miserable for the vast majority of people. And the countryside is getting marred by all of these, ugly factories, belching smoke into the sky, and and it's like they've got all these new social problems they've got to deal with, and people are. It just seems like all of these things were supposed to make life better are just making it worse. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that realism, it's like Tolkien takes it a step further and says, okay, yes, I think there is a sense in which how things are, and kind of describing them in a cold way, like a cold, detached way. That's kind of the realist approach. Yes. But Tolkien says, let's go one step beyond that, and let's accept reality for what it is, but also let's attempt to see things in a more spiritual way, right? In a sense of that we're not alone in this universe, but that we, that there's an end to this story, and though things might be ugly now, what is this? Where are we in the story, and what could this really be, right? It's almost an attitude of being grateful, right? Of being grateful in one's circumstances, and being able to look and say, okay, this might seem bad right now. This might be bad right now, but what is it that? How could my attitude towards this affect a change in the way I see it for the better, right? Or I might just look at my backyard and say man, I've got there's that same old tree in my backyard. But what if I go up and I actually look closely at it, and I start to notice just how beautiful the tree is, right? Or how magnificent it is in certain ways, right? Those, it's I guess those recovered ways of seeing that I think is what he means when he says seeing things as they were meant to be seen, right? And once you have seen that, once you have recovered that ability to see something in a greater way, then you can start to carry out art, start to carry out creativity, because then you say, this thing here, well, there's a horse, just a plain old horse, but what if you gave that horse wings? He uses that example somewhere else, right? Then you have a Pegasus, right? Yes. A flying horse of all things, right? Or, you might have cold iron here, but that could be the hiding place for a great sword. And what was it that I think Michelangelo used to say? I think it was him. He made David, right?
Yeah.
Michelangelo's David, yeah. I think he used to talk about how he just tried to bring out what was already in the marble, right? Like he basically tried to help what was already in the marble escape. And I think that's kind of that idea of recovery, right? So that's recovery. Escape. What is escape all about?
Escape. I think it's just. It is what it is, right? It's really finding yourself in another world, feeling like you're a part of something that's not your everyday life.
Well, so let me read this, because I think this section on escape, this long paragraph on escape, is one of the best things in here. So I'm going to read this. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. In what the misusers of escape are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently, as a rule, very practical, and may not even be heroic. In real life, it is difficult to blame it, unless it fails. In criticism, it would seem to be the worse the better it succeeds. Evidently, we are faced by a misuse of words and also by a confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other Reich, and even criticism of it as treachery. In the same way, these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only onto desertion, but onto real escape, and what are often its companions, disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Not only do they confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter, but they would seem to prefer the acquiescence of the quisling to the resistance of the patriot. To such thinking you only have to say, the land you love is doomed to excuse any treachery, indeed to glorify it. So, in a nutshell, he's basically saying, escape is in our nature, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, I hope that I would try to escape if I was thrown into a prison cell, especially if it was unjustly,
Sure. Yeah.
And, not to harm anybody in the process, but to try, right? Mm-hmm. And if I couldn't, then I hope that I would want to be creative so that mentally and spiritually I could escape from that place, mm-hmm. right? And from what it would try to do to my spirit, right?
Yes.
We think about the people, any various people over the centuries who have been in those kinds of situations and the great achievements they have made, right? Mm-hmm. Because of that desire for escape. And so this whole thing of escapism that like the fantasy often gets labeled with mm-hmm. and criticized for being, mm-hmm. oh, you're just, you just like that because you want to escape from the real world. And it's like, well, yeah, I do. It's not that I don't want to deal with my responsibilities, but I do want to escape to something more awesome, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's in our nature.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's that whole grass, that the grass is always greener. And also, and I think, too, that when you do escape, even if it is just for a little bit, when you return to your reality, you're better for it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know from experience, I am a better mom to my kids when I have the opportunity to go somewhere else and do my own thing for a couple of hours.
Right.
Right? So when you are able to remove yourself from that day in, day out, mundane routine, I think that when you return to it, I think you're able to view it with, it kind of goes hand in hand with that recovery, right? That you're able to see things in a new way because you've removed yourself from it for a while.
Yeah.
And you're able to appreciate it more.
Right. Well, it's that it leads to recovered seeing, right? To recovery in your vision. Mm-hmm. Like you've recovered the proper perspective, the way you're meant to see them, not the way as you see it right now, but the way you're meant to see it. Right. Even something like sleep, which we've talked about often mm-hmm. as being like, oh man, sometimes you just hit a point and I've learned that I just need to go to sleep.
Yeah.
Right. Where it's like, the things that seemed awesome that I was working on 4 hours ago that seemed awesome then, I'm like, my mind is just like telling me how much it sucks now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, now I've learned like, okay, I don't need to do anything else unless I need to go to sleep.
Right.
And it will, and inevitably it always seems better in the morning.
I mean, isn't sleep a form of escape?
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sleep is one of the greatest forms of escape.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I think that just goes to show that escape is in our nature. Right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Like we need it, right? I mean, sleep being a form of escape. I mean, there's a reason that that's a form of torture they use in prison camps, right?
Yeah.
It's keeping people from sleeping.
Right.
So just the fact that
it breaks their spirit.
Sleep, absolutely, and just the fact that we need to sleep to maintain our health. Mm-hmm. It totally speaks to the fact that we need to escape. And
the same with other legitimate good forms of escape, especially in creativity, right? Mm-hmm. That, we can become prisoners of our own minds and our own visions, our own spirituality. We see according to the Spirit, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Like we think we see with our eyes, but we really see according to the Spirit.
Yeah. The
eyes are just inputs, right? Our physical eyes are just inputs for our souls, right?
Yes.
Our spirits are the things that see things.
Right.
We make a million different presumptions, a million different observations and analyses of those observations in our minds and in our spirits that leads to the way that we feel about something.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
and we often just forget that. We just the modernist mindset says what I see is what I get, right? Well, it's actually what you see and how you feel about it, right?
Right, combined, yes.
Right? It's how you see leading to and kind of what your spirit does with that input, and then how you feel about it is the result, right?
Yes.
And sometimes your spirit needs to escape to be able to recharge and to be able to recover.
Yes. Absolutely true.
All right, so this idea of escape is leading up to the great escape. What is the great escape?
The great escape from death.
That's right.
Yep.
The escape from death. He says this is the great achievement of fairy stories. The human stories of the elves are doubtless full of the escape from deathlessness. They often... he says, death is the theme that most inspired George MacDonald, which is maybe one of the chief predecessors for Tolkien in terms of fairy tales.
Yeah, I was not familiar with him.
I haven't read much of his stuff either. He's somebody we should read soon, though.
Okay.
But all of this escape from death is leading to the idea of consolation. All right, what is consolation?
Happy ending, right?
Well, what is consolation in and of itself? He talks about the consolation of the happy ending, but what is consolation in and of itself? Console. What does it mean to console?
To feel better, or to make somebody feel better.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
You console somebody when...
It's joy.
What?
Joy.
No, not necessarily. When do you console?
You console when someone's upset.
Yeah, I think if you console someone
depressed,
when someone they love has died, right?
When they've lost.
Yeah, when you lose, right? The consolation, here's your consolation prize, right?
Right, yeah.
For losing.
That's true, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So consolation is kind of the final end of fairy stories, to be consoled in the notion that I'm going to die, which like in the modernist mindset it's the end. Mm-hmm. And it's again that thing that we're hurrying against and we're trying to push back against, but we know it's futile, right? Mm-hmm. We've lost some sense of that everything, so much of what we do is trying to hide from death, hide from the reality of death, right? And when we talk about escapism, that's not really what Tolkien is saying. He's not saying let's hide from the reality of death and be like, la 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 la, it's not going to happen, right? That's not what he's saying. Like Tolkien was very sober about his mortality and about the mortality of everyone he loved, and that goes right along with his Christianity, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, he was like, I'm going to die, right? That's right at the heart of Catholicism, holding Christ up there on the cross, right? Mm-hmm. That death is the reality, that this stark reality is coming, right? And it's coming for you and for every other human being.
I'm reminded of it.
Sorry to scare you if you didn't know that, right? But like he dealt with this in depth all throughout his career. That's one of the things he loved about Beowulf. In fact, and we'll talk about that when we talk about his Beowulf work eventually. But he looked back at the world before Christ and he said, these people, they knew death was coming, and that was like, and they had to just kind of like live their lives against this despair, right? Mm-hmm. So he says that fantasy gives us the consolation of the happy ending, because good fantasy will have a happy ending in it.
I found that interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's not something that I ever... I guess once I thought about it, I was like, oh yeah, I guess most of the fairies... again, I'm finding myself getting confused between fairy stories and fairy tales. But, I think that's the thing that really surprised me, like when I mentioned Little Mermaid before, was that the Disney Little Mermaid obviously has a happy ending, right? She becomes a person and she marries the prince and all this stuff. But in the actual original fairy tale, it does not have a happy ending.
Yeah.
Right? I forget exactly how it ends, but I remember it doesn't... I don't know if she dies or something. But so anyway, when I read that part about the happy ending, I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, because I didn't...
Yeah. Well, this is a really interesting conundrum, because as you might realize, and spoiler alert for those who have not yet read The Lord of the Rings or seen the movies. It's not exactly a happy ending. It's happy in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it's not exactly like the happy ending that we probably think of when we think of a happy ending.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not exactly and they all lived happily ever after. That's what... It's almost like Tolkien was thinking that's where the story was going to go. But I think he had some deeper thoughts as time went on and as he was writing The Lord of the Rings, because it wasn't published for 14 or 15 years after this, right? And I think he made some pretty stark observations. But even that word happy can be deceiving, because we think of happy and we think of like, oh, happy, I'm happy right now in the moment, right? Tolkien might have been inclined to think of it more along the lines of blessed, right? Blessedness, right? Which is the sense of eternal happiness, right?
Yeah.
Of a different kind of a transfigured happiness, right? A happiness that isn't necessarily of this world, and may even be tinged greatly with sorrow, right? With a sorrow that has been overcome, but still kind of a pain, right? Still that has been hard fought, and the person who is now maybe blessed still bears the marks of that sorrow and of that pain. Those are all deep thoughts that we'll get to eventually, but it is a little bit of a conundrum, because I think in a closer analysis, not all fairy stories necessarily have a happy ending.
Well,
right?
Not happy in the way that we think of happy.
Exactly.
Like you were just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll just leave that one in tension for the time being. But on the subject of happiness, he talks about the happy turn, which he terms what?
The happy term, Eucatastrophe.
Eucatastrophe, yeah. This is very key in Tolkien's work. Eucatastrophe is the notion of the turning of the tide, right, for good. That some big cataclysmic event happens, and instead of it being this thing that causes everything to go awful and wrong, it's the thing that makes everything turn out right, right? Or not make everything turn out right, but turns the story in the direction of the protagonists, right? In the direction of the heroes.
Yes.
Right? It's an unexpected good thing that happens. Right?
Yes. And he says the Eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function.
Yeah. Yeah. My actual favorite instance of Eucatastrophe is, and this is going to sound like heresy coming from me, but my actual favorite instance of Eucatastrophe is not in The Lord of the Rings. My favorite instance of Eucatastrophe is in Star Wars. When Luke is he is on his own in the trenches of the Death Star, and Darth Vader is on his tail, literally about to pull the. He's like, "I have you now," and he's about to shoot him and kill Luke, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon come in blazing, and Han Solo's giving his cowboy call, here I come, right, and thwarts Darth Vader from killing Luke right there, and it's totally, I mean, you've seen it. If you're like me, you've seen it a million times, so you know to expect it. But it never ceases to be just awesome, and because you're like, Luke didn't know that was happening, right? And it's just the most thrilling thing, because he thought Han had abandoned him, right? He thought Han had turned and run, right, taken his reward, and here he comes. He's back. This unexpected help. I think that unexpected thing is very key in all of this. That it just comes out of nowhere, right? Because it gives the sense of the supernatural, of the miraculous, right? Of somebody watching out, a greater power watching out. That's my view of it.
Yeah, no, I dig that. That's cool. I don't remember that unexpected thing being a part of it. Does Tolkien mention that the whole notion of it being unexpected?
I don't know. I can't. I don't want to search right this second to try and find that, but that's kind of that's just my analysis of it.
No, it makes sense. Like, it totally makes sense. Because I remember, obviously, I've heard the term Eucatastrophe before, and this was the first time I actually read truly what was really behind it, and I loved it. Like, I loved the idea of it, but to me, it was more of just like a really of a very good thing happening, like a blessed event. And doesn't he even say, because he kind of juxtaposes drama with fairy story, right? And he says the highest function of drama is, we would say, tragedy, right? Whereas with fairy story, it's the opposite of that, and that's why he coins the term Eucatastrophe. So I understood that Eucatastrophe would be a positive thing as opposed to tragedy, right? It's almost a form of, the opposite of tragedy would be comedy. So Eucatastrophe is not comedic, but it's a positive thing. But I didn't, anyway, all that to say, I didn't pick up on the whole unexpected thing, but I like that interpretation of it being...
Well, but Harry, so here's what he says. It is the mark of a good fairy story of the higher or more complete kind that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to or indeed accompanied by tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a peculiar quality. I mean, it is joy that he's talking about. But in order for that to happen, it has to be unexpected, right? At least the first time you experience it, right? Because if you knew it was going to happen, then it wouldn't...
That's true.
Then
it would probably make you happy, but it wouldn't be that same intense joy.
It's the intensity of it, right?
Right, yeah.
I mean, you and I have experienced things that certainly seem miraculous, right, in the last few years. And we're not ones who easily call things miraculous. But having experienced those things, for me, the sensation was definitely like that, right? And it would not have been the same if I had known it was going to happen,
right? Yeah.
You tend to take it for granted if you know it's going to happen, but when you don't, it becomes this great joy, right?
Yes.
It's almost like it's so fundamental that it's hard to explain why that is, but anyway, it is what it is. All right. Epilogue. So in the epilogue, he talks about the twin Eucatastrophes of man's history, which he identifies as the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ. So Tolkien is showing his true colors here. At the end of the day, he's basically saying, look, all of this is really based on my understanding of the gospel, right? And I love the way Tolkien casts the Gospels as a story, and as the story in which we live, right? He is not saying that the story of Christ is a myth in the way that we think of other myths, right? He's saying, like Tolkien would say, that it's the true myth, right?
Yes.
Or that like Lewis would say, it's the true myth, right? It's the myth that actually happened, like no kidding, actually happened, and is happening in our own world.
Right.
So how is the incarnation a Eucatastrophe?
He says the birth of Christ is the Eucatastrophe of man's history, right?
Yeah.
Because without the birth of Christ, you don't have the resurrection. If Christ never came, then you don't have the cross, and you don't have the resurrection, and you don't have eternal life.
Right.
Right. So
what did you have before? Like, don't think in terms of I'm a Jew before Christ. Think in terms of like pagans before Christ. What was their outlook on death?
That's it. Right. There's nothing more.
Right. Now, different pagans had different kind of cultic views, right? Some of them had different views of kind of paradises they went to, right? But they were various in different places, and for all they knew, really, death was death, right? Death was the end, right? And so the coming of Christianity, right, the birth of Christ changes all that. It says death is not the end. In fact, we still have to go through death. We still have to suffer death.
Right.
But death becomes our victory. Yeah. Right? Death, when it's this thing we go into righteously, becomes a thing where we're far more powerful than we previously imagined. Right? The story of Christ turns our sufferings on their head. Right? On their heads. Turns our sufferings upside down. Right? So they become weapons.
It makes them so much greater.
Right.
Than just sufferings, yes.
Yeah. So the resurrection and the incarnation are the two eucatastrophes of man's history. He says, where is it? The joy would have exactly the same quality, if not the same degree, as the joy which the turn in a fairy story gives. Such joy has the very taste of primary truth. It looks forward or backward. The direction of this regard, in this regard, is unimportant to the great eucatastrophe. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it is preeminently high and joyous. Because this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. I love that note. Legend and history have met and fused, right?
Yes.
That all of this stuff, and I think, again, here we see this overlap with Tolkien where the lines are blurring between the primary reality and creative reality, right? Yes. Secondary reality. I really think that Tolkien, what he was trying to tell us in things like Mythopoeia and in this and in Leaf by Niggle, was that he sort of harbored this little view within himself that said, our creative works are not just these little things that we do and they're just kind of trifles that we spend our time on.
Right.
Our creative works have an end and a much greater end than we actually realize.
Right.
Right. Again, that's one of the big themes of Leaf by Niggle.
Right. He even says that at the end.
Yeah, he does.
I love the ending of this.
Go ahead and read it. Well, just whatever you want to read.
Just all tales may come true.
Yeah.
And yet at the last redeemed. They may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them as man. Finally redeemed will be like and unlike the fallen that we know.
Yeah.
I just love that.
Right.
And it kind of, when I read it, I read it 3 times. I was like, wow. I think my mind was just blown.
I know.
I mean, I'm still wrapping my head around it. 'Cause I'm like, that's incredibly profound, really. And I can't even explain what it is about it, but it's just beautiful.
Right.
And it makes that final, that victory of the cross really take on a whole new light, in a sense.
Oh yeah.
Because you realize that's why, that is the reason. The resurrection is the reason that all these things will eventually be redeemed, right? And we don't know what that's going to look like, right? But we know it's going to be good,
right? Yeah, and what he says right before that too about so great is the bounty with which man has been treated that he may now perhaps fairly dare to guess that in fantasy he may actually assist in the affiliation and multiple enrichment of creation, right? Again, we see that in Leaf by Niggle, where Niggle goes and in purgatory he creates what he doesn't know it's purgatory. It's never called that, but what he creates this. He starts actually realizing his creative vision there, right? And it turns into this actual real place.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
What was 2-dimensional before and only kind of blurry and glimpsed at a distance gains its own reality.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I really do think that Tolkien was onto something very powerful here, and that God's intention for our creative gifts, for our creative abilities, is to give them their own reality in a way that if we look at that and just say, well, oh, there's going to be a Middle Earth, then I don't think that's really what Tolkien is saying.
No.
I think it's far
Tolkien,
more profound.
Right?
Well, it might be. I'm just saying it's far more profound than we can really put words to, right? Or we can even envisage, right?
Yes.
It's something like that, but a million times more profound, right?
Right.
Because when we make things, we don't get them quite right. They're not perfect, right? Here and now. Only God can perfect something, right? We try to get it as best we can, but only God can give it the perfection, right? So.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, well, yeah, pretty great stuff.
Yeah, it really is.
So,
it's pretty amazing.
As we go into Lord of the Rings, I think we want to remember, those ideas of escape, because here's the thing. Tolkien works all of these things out in Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is very much an exploration of these various things that he talks about in here. And we're going to see that as we go throughout. I mean, every one of his ideas that he names in there is, I think, richly a part of the Lord of the Rings. Secondary world, secondary belief, consolation, escape, recovery, Eucatastrophe. All of those ideas are very key and kind of peppered throughout. And that's, again, what makes it such an incredible story, is that kind of philosophical, spiritual undergirding that it has.
Yeah.
That you don't perceive as some kind of treatise, but as just a natural part of the story, right? As a natural outgrowth of the way he tells the story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Things that you in a way realize are there, but you don't know really their purpose or how to describe them. So I'm excited to read Lord of the Rings again, having read this now. I feel like it's gonna make my second reading even richer.
Yeah. I'm sure it will. Yeah.
Yeah. Make it more meaningful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for reading that. I know it was kind of a chore to read the first time through. It's not an easy read, but it's worth it.
It is worth it, yes.
So thank you. Thank you for having the patience to do it. And thank you everyone for listening. And we will definitely be starting Lord of the Rings Chapter 1 next time.
Can I get a pinky swear on that?
I can't pinky swear. Just take my word for it.
Okay.
Hey, I haven't lied to you yet. I said last time that I wasn't sure. I thought we might do on fairy stories, and then immediately afterwards, I was like, yeah, we're going to do on fairy stories. So, next time, though, we're going to start Lord of the Rings. Lord willing, we're going to start Lord of the Rings, Chapter 1. So,
all right.
Yeah.
I'll look forward to it.
All righty. I shall as well. All right, well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we will talk at you next time.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Please remember to check out truemyths.org for show notes as well as other Tolkien goodness. Also, we hope you're enjoying the podcast as much as we enjoy making it. Please leave us a rating and feedback on iTunes. On the next episode, we will finally begin our discussion of Chapter 1 of The Lord of the Rings, a long-expected party. Please tune in, and thanks for listening.